the future of Ukraine in Europe. And our panelists, Ambassador James O'Brien, former head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination at the US Department of State, Dorka Takácsy, researcher, Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy, Renáta Uitz, senior research fellow, CEU Democracy Institute, professor of law and government, Royal Holloway, University of London, and the moderator, Zsuzsanna Végh, program officer, German Marshall Fund.
Is it working? Great. So just wanted to quickly check with the organizers if our time is now reduced or we do have our 1 hour. 50 minutes? We'll see. We'll aim for 55, okay? All right. So I would like to also welcome you to this 6th panel of the day and 10th session overall. I think looking around the room really shows that this is a hot topic, so very nicely strategically placed in the afternoon. I commend the organizers for that. But we also have a great line of speakers who will be helping us to go through this deceptively simple title of a topic from various angles. So we are going to talk about the future of Ukraine in Europe. Without a Ukrainian on the panel, therefore, I think we will situate our discussions more in how the dynamics that we see unfolding over the past few years are really transforming also Europe's role in shaping the security environment on the continent and how, under the current circumstances, it can still support the European path of Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is Europe, and Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated that as a European country, it seeks to also join the European Union. It has faced serious consequences for this choice over the years. Of course, one is the full-scale invasion by Russia 3.5 years ago, but we should not forget that the war in Ukraine has been going on for over a decade since essentially in this context, I would like to explore a little bit how the security environment really has changed in Europe's east. And we have great experts to go through that topic, but I also would like to take some time to look at closely the European integration prospects. I would like to start with the simple question to Ambassador O'Brien. How you see the dynamics and developments of the past few months, the renewed talks between the United States and Russia, the repeated meetings between President Trump and President Zelensky shaping the course of the war. And if you will, could you please make sense of President Trump's policy towards the war in Ukraine for us?
I agree that this war needs a ceasefire. That was what we were driving toward in 2024. I think President Trump always grabs the telescope by the wrong end, though. But gravity is kind of working, right? We're sort of working our way back towards something that may make sense. He seemed to believe that if he had a friendly deal with Russia, that it would be possible to work out details in Ukraine. I saw, here are a couple examples of how he's approached this. So his first venture into the newest phase of the war came in, say, November of 2023, when he told the House of Representatives if they voted to provide more aid to Ukraine, he would support challengers against vulnerable Republicans. The result was then that the Speaker of the House would not put assistance packages up for a vote until almost May. So think of how critical this time was. Ukraine had just tried its counteroffensive. It needed to restock. And the point of that restocking would be that then it could repulse Russia in 24, begin carrying the fight behind the front lines, and tell Russia that it was time to stop the fighting. And instead, for 8 months, not a dime of help got to Ukraine. That was because of President Trump. After a conversation with Prime Minister Orban, actually. Now, I think what it showed President Putin was that these guys, the party of peace, wanted peace so badly that he could keep fighting. By the way, when the legislation passed the House, it passed with more than 300 votes in the House and 70 votes in the Senate. So he didn't change a single vote, but he did delay and push us into 2024 in a very difficult period. During our transition, normally we have 3 months. Normally there's a lot of back and forth between the incoming and the outgoing people, even when it's what we call a hostile transition like this one, you know, between a Democrat, Republican, or vice versa. In this case, the only topic that Republicans would talk to me about was whether Russia could be a reliable business partner. And my point was no, not in the slightest. But the sense was that if a series of commercial deals could be put in place between the US and Russia, some sanctions relief, maybe, maybe not, but if those deals were in place, then there would be an understanding and the war in Ukraine could stop. And that's why it's Kirill Dmitriev and a real estate developer on the American side leading the talks. They don't talk about security, they talk about this stuff. That didn't work. Now throughout, and I'm wrapping this up, throughout, we saw European leaders come forward with what I think are pretty good suggestions that say Europe will do more. They want some help from America with our unique capabilities, and they want some assurance that that's going to go forward. And I think as Europe has delivered more and more, that has made it possible for Trump to now be in a position where it may be feasible to start looking at a ceasefire. And the final point I'll make here is the Ukrainians have done extraordinarily well in this period, not just playing the diplomacy so that they are never the ones to say no, but adding military capabilities that they're able to carry the fight toward the Russians. That matters because it shows President Trump that Ukraine does hold some cards, in his own phrase. And Europe has done well, as in addition, by saying that it will cut off transit of imports of Russian gas, but also will consider reducing Russian oil, something he's now insisting on. That will matter here, and it will be a test of Prime Minister Orban's relationship to President Trump. But the fact that Ukraine can now threaten Russia's exports of gas and oil into Europe, and that Europe is willing to cut those off, means many of the commercial deals that were driving the initial US approach are now off the table. And now we're into a discussion that I think is somewhat more healthy. It's tragic that we've had an extra year of the war and all the death and destruction as a result of it. But I feel like we're getting to a place where it's the security issues that matter again, rather than this dream that commerce can solve the conflict.
Thank you very much. You had this phrasing that Putin saw that these guys want peace so much that he can keep on fighting. And I'm wondering whether the renewal of contact now between the President of the United States and of Russia, the meeting in Anchorage, does not seem to resonate with this. So whereas Putin is engaging in talks about peace, about ceasefire, ending the war, his attacks on Ukraine continue. In fact, in certain cases, we see escalation. So I'm wondering, and Dorka is very well placed to shed some light on this. How is this renewed engagement altering the calculations of the Russian and the Ukrainian side in the war, and what it foretells us about the trajectory that we can expect in the near future?
Well, thank you very much for the word. Probably I have an easier job than Ambassador did, because I do not have to try to find the logic in events which contain little seeds of logic alone and exclusively. So yeah, eventually what we have seen, all these events which we have seen in the recent future, well, they were spectacular on the one hand, rather a circus, looking at it from another perspective, but eventually they resulted in a big PR victory for Russia. So eventually what the Russian reading of all what happened is that really, well, all these people in Europe, all these people in Ukraine, well, they really do want the peace just so badly that they are ready to go along with our terms. So eventually the Russian reading of all what happened is that, well, unity is weak. Well, they are not necessarily well placed either. Therefore, what Russia senses at the moment, what the Putin regime senses at the moment, is that, well, all flags are high for Russia. Why would they stop? And eventually, I think that this is one of the key factors why we do see escalations on the front line from Russia's side, especially. So what we have seen in the recent month, I'm sure that you have also been following the news about just let's remember a few key events eventually, what we have seen. So what we saw, which is a clear tendency, is that the volume of air attacks has increased drastically. So I know that here many of our lovely guests are from Hungary and are especially concerned with news with regards to Hungary. Obviously, these things are very close to our heart. So when the attack happened to Munkacsy, well, that also was not a single attack, not a single target there. On that very night, we have seen in the air over 540 drones, plus glide bombs, plus rockets, and all these things which Russia managed to fly. So eventually what we saw was that, well, numbers are growing. And numbers grew further ever since. The record, this very sad record, was in September, on the 7th of September, with over 800 drones in a single night, plus 13 rockets, and all these other things. So if looking at the sheer numbers, it is enough to see and to judge that, well, Russia feels that, well, it's worth to escalate. It's definitely worth to escalate. This is what we see there. We also see some other parts and other aspects of escalation. So, for instance, take the targeted attack on the Danish demining team, resulting in 2 deaths. Well, this is something which we have not seen on this front line yet. Very targeted, very punctual, very successful. This is one thing. The other thing, looking back, is that there are other civilian harms which are not necessarily unprecedented, but these are things which we have not seen for a very long time. Take Yarova in Donetsk region, where 24 pensioners were hit. There was absolutely no strategic object nearby. These were pensioners queuing, standing in line for their pensions. So what we see there is that Russia clearly feels, well, it can do basically whatever it wants. And it does. However, also to mention what we see on the Ukrainian side, because we have also seen certain novelties in a way there, is that we see that the cross-border operations and the scope of these have expanded. So we see an increased use of these long-range drones, and we have seen very targeted and rather successful strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. Yet again, this is something which was pretty prevalent also looking at the Hungarian news, because one of the key targets was the Unecsa oil pumping station. This is the very strategic point which is basically crucial for the Russian energy infrastructure, and not only for Russia, because Unecsa, this oil pumping station, is the place where 3 branches meet. One of those branches eventually comes further to here, supplies Slovakia, supplies Hungary. This is the well-known Druzhba or friendship pipeline. So this is there on the one hand. While we know that Hungarian governmental propaganda was suggesting that, well, evil Ukrainians are only targeting this in order to annihilate the Hungarian energy security, this is all against Hungary, well, most likely this is not more than a side effect. I'm not saying Ukrainians necessarily regret this side effect. However, it would be, I think, a wild thing to think that this was the key target there, especially so because if we look at what the two other branches are coming further from there, on the one hand, one of these other lines is going further to Belarus. What happens there with this crude oil in Belarus, that this is getting refined there and goes back to Russia, therefore it's crucially important for Russia. And third, which is also pretty important, is that, well, the third branch goes further to the Baltic Sea, supplying the well-known Shadow Fleet, which also generates tremendous contributions to the state budget of Russia. Therefore, hitting the Unice pipeline was something clearly strategic to Ukraine and most likely could not have happened without at least a silent agreement from the West. So this is one thing, which is definitely something new. This is something which we have not witnessed in the last 3.5 years. We have also seen certain adaptive defense measures in the Kharkiv region especially, where we have seen that Ukraine has defended pretty successfully against infiltration via underground infrastructure, which means eventually pipes. So we see these things all over. If we zoom out, we see that there is a slow, very slow Russian advancement, centimeter by centimeter on Ukraine's soil, losing tremendous masses of people. So the manpower shortage is lurking, I would say, but the advancement is certainly there.
Thank you very much for the overview, Dorka. We have briefly touched on the place of Europe, the EU, in addressing the war in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine. Under the current changing circumstances. First, I would keep the question with you two being the security experts on the panel. Where do you see a potential stronger role for the European Union to step up, to continue its support for Ukraine, how sustainable that can be? And ultimately, in this changing environment, we hear a lot about security guarantees. But how can we get there? What should be the next steps from the European side? Ambassador Dorka?
As I mentioned, I think Europe has started well by committing to increasing its own defense spending, its investment in Ukraine's capacities to defend itself, and now looking at how to deal with the incursion into Poland. This was something we worked very hard on, and I think maybe because of a succession of election campaigns in Poland, and the fact that the Russian incursion seemed minimal, maybe accidental, that it was difficult to get support for the kind of robust air patrol and defensive arrangements that would have made sense. But now it looks like it's happening. All of that, I think, is a very good step on the part of Europe. The fact that Ukraine has responded with solidarity by offering assistance to Poland is also both, I think, helpful politically, but a sign of what Ukraine's integration into European spaces will mean over time. You know, in one sense, the choice for Europe with this war is that the two most experienced, largest, and well-armed societies in Europe are fighting a decade-long war that has been incredibly intense over the last 3.5 years. And the choice for Europe really is whether it wants one of those armies to be in a bellicose posture toward it, Russia, or whether it wants two of those armies to be upset with it, but depending on how it engages with Ukraine. And I think we're on a path to have a much more constructive relationship with Ukraine, a part of providing security and expertise for Europe. And I think that's a much healthier place for Europe to be. Now, what's a next step that Europe can take? In the near term, it's securing capabilities that need to be provided to Ukraine, because Ukraine cannot provide them itself. So those are talked about a lot with LIFT, with satellite surveillance intelligence, but also sophisticated weapons in air defense. Over the next couple of years, the more that Europe produces itself and the more it procures from the US, the better Ukraine will be able to withstand what I think will be an escalating Russian campaign, particularly as we come to heating season. How does Europe make clear that it's prepared to do this for as long as it takes? Because already there are monetary problems. I think this is where the immobilized Russian sovereign assets matter. This is across jurisdictions, 300 billion or more US. That amounts to probably 8 years of spending on the war for Ukraine. You know, you could vary it a little, but it's at least 5 years. And I think that's the place to indicate strong support that will continue beyond this presidential term in the US, but into the future. And that's, I think, a key marker of whether Europe's ready to continue on the path that it has started.
Thank you very much. Dorka, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, just a couple of words. So yeah, eventually I myself was thinking about what kind of conclusions can we draw from the provocation targeting Poland, which obviously has dominated the worldwide news recently, when we have seen these 19 Gerbera drones. These were decoy drones, because we know that eventually Russia, not according to any normal calculus, is interested in a direct confrontation with Europe, looking at kinetic operations, for instance. But we know that they love to meddle in gray zones, they love to use all these hybrid methods, and they love to test what the NATO is all about, whether NATO is able and willing to act in a coordinated way. Basically, what it means. What does it mean to belong to NATO if we boil it down to practicalities, sheer practicalities, as we have seen in Poland? So what we have seen was that there were these decoy drones coming. What a decoy drone is, basically, it is a drone which, if the air defense capabilities notice and identify it, it looks almost exactly like a normal drone filled with explosives. But these are not. These are not, therefore we can assume that Russia had an intention to kind of turn down the escalation risk, but this was not known from the very beginning. Therefore, by using these very, very cheap drones, which were not even containing explosives, they forced a NATO country into using, in order to counter it, a very expensive weaponry, aircrafts which are terribly expensive to keep in the air. So we have seen that they have provoked a very expensive answer to a very cheap provocation. So what they were doing was to test what we are able and what we are willing to do. On the one hand, I think that the Polish reaction has shown that, well, yes, NATO exists, because what they were calling for, they have called for Article 4, joint consultation immediately all across NATO, and this knowledge sharing, well, this had happened, so therefore we can cite, because, well, apparently NATO exists. On the other hand, what we see now is that, yes, there is a desperate need on our side to learn from the Ukrainians who know what to do with drones, who know how to deal with these drones, and doing it in a far more efficient way than the way we did. What we have also learned, and where we still have to develop a lot, is that, well, Russia is not only deploying these drones, but they were also covering it with an immense information operation. Because you have probably also met these news, according to which, well, these were not even Russian drones. this was Ukraine misleading all of us by drones put together from the crashes and the scratches of Russian drones. They were misleading us all. Russia has nothing to do with it. Basically, it's all Ukraine. Well, these narratives were spreading all around. So there is still a lot more we can do if we want to defend ourselves as well. But eventually, I think that here the key conclusion I would say here, also to respond to your question finally, is that, well, these Russian efforts are directed at dividing us. Because simply now, the question comes more and more actual, probably more actual than ever, whether European countries should pass all their air defense capabilities to Ukraine. Because now, if we perceive that there is a risk, well, ourselves, we can also be targets. Well, probably let's just not give all over. Let's just not give all our air defense system over to Ukraine. Well, this is exactly what Russia wants. So I think that this very incident has simply shown us that, well, we have to think strategically, probably more strategically than we were before. We have to recognize all these efforts which divide us, and also we have to involve Ukraine. And in many aspects, they are ahead of us. They are ahead of us, and we have a lot of things to learn from them, because no one knows Russian drones and how to counter them effectively now in the whole world than Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And this is where I would pass the floor to Renáta. Both of you have been highlighting the value of cooperating with Ukraine, between Europe and Ukraine, and that we can learn from Ukraine. But this also obviously shapes our strategic thinking about that cooperation. Where do you see this thinking going in Europe, Renáta?
Thank you. Thank you very much for putting the question in these terms. I think that it's worth going one step back to ask, how did we come to talk about the relationship of Ukraine and Europe in terms of EU enlargement? Because that was already a strategic choice. It's a choice which was made by the Commission. They could have set the terms in very different in a very different matrix. It was the Commission that started to talk about Ukraine's European perspective, and then the frame was very quickly shifted to full enlargement and the prospect of full membership. Putting the frame in these terms was, on the one hand, delimiting the scope of the conversation, of framing the conversation and setting boundaries. At the same time, it also produces momentous challenges. So when the Union itself and the Commission itself put Ukrainian enlargement as a strategic priority for the EU, they definitely did show the Union's cards in looking for a geopolitical purpose for this entire venture that you call the European Union. Symbolically, this was a momentous shifting of a frame, but practically, this was an extremely risky move. If you think just for 1 second, enlargement in the European Union at the time when this promise was made hasn't been done in a while, and enlargement on this scale hasn't been done essentially since the post-communist enlargement. So this is a risk, and this is a gamble which has to be worth the political price of figuring out what the EU is about. Now, if you think about enlargement in this unprecedented setting, we have very, very unusual ground conditions. No enlargement has been done when borders were contested. And then we have the geostrategic and geopolitical uncertainty with President Trump at the wheel and President Putin in the pantry. That is just complicating things way forward, and this is before the peace attempt. This is also technically, and enlargement is a bureaucratic process. Let's not forget that for a second. It's the most diverse enlargement because it's not only about Ukraine or Moldova, but the enlargement package includes the entire Western Balkans, and like it or not, the suspended enlargement of accession of Turkey that is also on the plate. So when you are thinking in terms of geopolitical complexity, it's best to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the most hopeful framings that are on the table at the moment, people like to talk about multiple enlargement scenarios and place them in the broader context of what people of this trade call differentiated integration. They call it differentiated internal as well as differentiated external integration. Differentiated integration internally would mean most probably a multi-stage or multi-step enlargement, signaling to Ukraine, but also to the US and Russia that this can take a decade or even longer before we get from a candidate status to full membership. Now, at the same time, the European Union has a bit of a spot of its own problem. We call it the rule of law crisis. Decent people call it democratic backsliding. So there is a serious conversation about membership modalities to be internally differentiated. Essentially, some member states being downgraded to less than full members, while we are getting up to compliance with the basic accession criteria. Now, this was the gloomy part. The promising part is differentiated external integration, which is new partnership and association modalities with the Union. On the one hand, you do see attempts like the European political community, which invited some players where President Putin's heart, I'm sure, was truly warmed when he saw those meetings with Central Asian leaders and Viktor Orban at the coffee table. At the same time, this is also a moment where post-Brexit UK is on the rise as a European player, trying to open channels and keep diplomatic channels open that were not open before. Now, another shift in framing, apart from differentiated integration, which I hope you love because it just rolls off the tongue, is the conversation about public goods, especially European public goods. European public goods include a conversation about how the EU delivers not only economic competitiveness and financial or fiscal equalization, but also security, defense, and strategic autonomy. This is much more in terms of languages that we are used to. This brings us very close to the EU's own internal political processes, both on the EU level and on the membership level. And the first conversation, the first serious conversation that we are going to have about these public goods is going to take place in the framework of the budget negotiations that is discussing the new multi-annual financial framework. And my massive information here is not going to surprise anyone in this room, that the budget negotiations within the EU are rich with opportunities for veto plays. Funding any of these public goods will require mobilizing both own resources and the EU's own debt at scale that we haven't seen before. And veto players such as Hungary are going to have a field day.
Thank you very much, Renáta. You covered a lot of grounds, and I would maybe pick up on this last point that you made. The negotiations, the veto players, and that Ukraine's potential accession is really unfolding in an environment where institutional reforms are needed, budgetary resources are not guaranteed, political support is at risk. In fact, you probably all remember the famous bathroom break that opened the path for Ukraine's EU integration. In this context, while so much is still up for debate about the future of delivering public goods in Europe, about the future modalities of differentiated external integration, or just simply EU enlargement as such, how can pro-European forces support the EU integration of Ukraine? How can Ukraine remain committed to this path? And moreover, Renáta, you mentioned the so-called rule of law crisis or democratic backsliding we see in the European Union. EU membership is also about adhering to certain democratic norms. How can we ensure that Ukraine continues on its path of democratization in the context of the war? What can European actors do to support this course? Anybody who would like to jump in on this first?
Okay, so well, I know that when we are talking about the business usually, or when we are talking about how to make processes more effective, I know that there is one key thing which we always have to eliminate, which is redundancy. So if there are parallel structures, you should get rid of those parallel structures immediately. Waste of time, waste of money. In our case, probably this is the exact opposite, the polar opposite of what we have to do. Because if we want to get rid of, or at least lessen the power of all these vetoes and these threatenings of vetoes, we probably have to construct parallel structures simply to get around them and to avoid them. So I know that this is something very general to say, but probably creating redundancies in these systems is one of the guaranteeing factors that we can actually reach something in the very end. Now you have mentioned that what we can do in order to keep Ukraine on this track. Well, there are certain good news also in this seemingly chaotic place, scene and situation. So the good news is that the people of Ukraine, they do want to stay on this road. They do not want to turn back to Russia. They do not want to turn back to the more chaotic times with larger corruption, with oligarchs, with situations which we do not wish for ourselves. Well, they do not wish to return to those either. Probably one of why I'm thinking about is that we have seen a very clear example of how much Ukraine does actually not want that. When recently the two anti-corruption entities were touched by President Zelensky. These are the NABU and the SAPO. Well, I think that there the president and his circle have probably not only estimated probably poorly what the reaction of the West is going to be if these structures are touched by at least a finger, but what they have probably not calculated properly was the Ukrainian population's immediate reaction. So if you have seen the news, then, well, already the day after these things were announced, there were people on the streets, and not only in Kyiv, but basically in every single city where there is a considerable amount of people, of youth, of eventually active people who were simply following the news and saw that, wow, well, this step looks menacing. We don't really know what this is, but it looks like a step on the road which is going to take us back to somewhere where we clearly do not want to go. So if you look at not only this, but also at the public opinion polls, it's clear that, well, Ukraine wants to integrate Europe. They want to join this kind of sphere. They do want to integrate in this bloc. not as if they had any other choice. But if you look back at how it used to be before, especially before the 2014 events, well, if you look back at the time, this unanimous support towards the Western integration was absolutely not there, especially if you look at what kind of support was centering around, for instance, in the support of joining NATO. Well, it has never been particularly high. Well, ever since we all know all the things which have happened, we see that, well, Ukraine and the people of Ukraine have no other way. They know it very well as well. Therefore, at least, well, this is a silver lining. People want to belong to this part of the world.
May I now bring in Renáta, and I would just pose you a question that you may or may not answer. But you are a legal scholar. You have been working on illiberalism and illiberal constitutionalism. You have been looking at a variety of countries' experiences. What does that tell you about Ukraine, about the challenges that backsliding illiberalism could pose to the reform path of Ukraine that we should particularly be wary about?
Thanks. I promised to answer, but somewhat indirectly, because let me start from where Dorka left off, and some people in this room may have been alive when EU accession happened in Hungary. And if it didn't change your lives on a daily basis, this is because it's a bureaucratic process which is pretty underwhelming. It requires filling out charts, producing papers, and meeting deadlines, which civil servants usually do in ministries. And then every once in a while, these mid-ranking civil servants go to mid-ranking meetings in Brussels. The bottom line is that, and this is a big lesson from East European enlargement or the post-communist enlargement, is that you can change all these rules and change the charts without ensuring the basic social embedding of the enlargement process. The success of enlargement depends on its relevance and on the support of the private sector, that is private business, and also the support of society at large. Democratic backsliding in these countries, including Hungary, cannot fully be understood without understanding the democracy deficit of the European enlargement process and the resulting incapacity of government to be able to independently make and implement policy, and especially to manage political and social conflict in a setting where resources might be scarce, such as economic crisis. This is a very, very important lesson from East Central Europe. And this is when we come to with a neat segue to Ukraine. At this point, people will tell you that, okay, you have your democratic deficit, civil society will fix it for you all. And Ukraine is fine because Ukrainian civil society is very active, it's vibrant, there is not a thing that Ukrainian civil society cannot deliver. Whether this is fixing drones, mobilizing funds, mobilizing resources, running a field hospital, education, policy making, or taking care of the elderly, or running a soup kitchen, Ukrainian civil society can do it all. They do have the demonstrated ability, survey after survey. So definitely you can also load EU enlargement onto civil society. Now, this sounds, of course, excellent as a solution, except civil society cannot take over the functions of government. Apart from the fact that civil society is already stretched extremely thin, the whole point and purpose of any civil society is to deliver these goods until one wishes to do so in their free time. Conceptually, a second big issue is that, of course, civil society has tasks in recovery and reconstruction, including ensuring the reintegration of veterans, on which very few of European civil society dealers have much experience. And actually, a civil society which is in defense mode operates very differently from the volunteer civil society in peace mode. Now, it's extremely important to be aware of the features of Ukrainian civil society in defense mode. Chatham House has a wonderful report from this summer. And this is a feature to be taken into account. Now, a third point which I think is important to bring here is what will make integration work, because it's one thing if member states support it and the union institutions want to make it happen. Voters also have to support it. And if you look at the recent Eurobarometer from this summer, you will see that European voters want the Union as a priority to defend and protect them from global crises and security risks. It's a 66% support among the voters. The good news is that it's one of those public goods for which the EU at the moment has no resources and not quite a mandate to deliver on. Security is higher in the pecking order of the European voters than economic competition. The top values which the voters expect the Union to deliver is peace, it's at 45%, democracy at 32%, and human rights at 22%. Now, this should tell us two things. First of all, the voters expect the Union to deliver this and not their governments. And second, there is extremely low support for democracy and human rights within the Union. At least this is not declining. But when you try to put pressure on Ukrainian civil society to do more for democracy and human rights, just have a look at how much of the European citizens are willing to commit to, in principle, at the level of responding to a survey, and not in practice when it comes to committing their own time for these purposes.
Thank you very much. And speaking of civil society and support for democracy, this is where I would bring in the American on the panel. And I would like to ask you about the role of the United States going forward in this. Of course, Ukraine's Europeanization, as we discussed, also goes together with a democratization path. And the United States have been an important player in promoting democracy, supporting democratic actors, which does not seem to be, well, to put it this way, high on the agenda of the new administration. How do you see this impacting this particular geography and Ukraine's democratic European path?
The U.S. should, and to this point has, supported the Commission's decision to invite Ukraine to accede. I think even in the Trump administration, now it is proposing to take out substantial wealth from Ukraine. Whether that deal can survive scrutiny, I don't know. But it is committed, the Trump administration, to seeing that Ukraine not go back to the blue-orange days when a business could not rely upon a stable environment. So there's that. That, I think, is a realistic incentive for the U.S. to continue supporting. I think we have to avoid clashes, that the agreement between any agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine has to be consistent with the obligations Ukraine will undertake. And I think we have to work together to try to keep public support for Ukraine's European path alive, and both in Ukraine but also in Europe. And some of that is by demonstrating the very real capabilities that Ukraine will bring to the EU. So Renáta mentioned the security contributions, and I think playing those up will be important. I think the same may be true around economic contributions that go beyond simply the 5 to 8 million Ukrainians who are contributing to economic activity, across the EU. But the difficulty for the US at the moment, right, they're a little schizophrenic. We now have increased American incentive to see Ukraine put the rule of law in place and move toward Europe, but we've cut our ability to do that. So the elimination of AID and the gutting of the State Department's ability to provide assistance is really bad. And I'll just give 3 quick anecdotes of this. The first is we're blinding ourselves. So AID used to pay for some of the best focus group work in Ukraine. And I know when I sat down with President Zelensky last year to say, let's discuss what can be a path toward a ceasefire, the most important bit of information I could provide him were these high-quality focus groups that showed much of his public was willing to support a ceasefire, even if it came without guarantees of getting back all the lost territory. He was functioning on the basis of kind of informal soundings in which virtually all Ukrainians said, we want to fight till victory. And becoming aware of the subtle differences in public opinion was vitally important to him then developing what he called the victory package, which he rolled out last August and September publicly. That came because of AID funding. Now, good news is that I think a European country has stepped up to begin funding that same work now, but we've now gone 8 to 10 months without this kind of high quality work in the field. It's unbelievable that you want to know less when you're making policy to end a war. The second problem that it causes particularly goes to the problem, I'm going to call it equal justice, because it's not just anti-corruption in the sense of somebody, putting his son as CEO of a business. For Ukrainians, as many of them said, we want to make sure there's no favoritism in the system. As they said, we want to see the war end on just terms. So this is the most live nerve in the Ukrainian political world, as we heard from Dorka and others. Ukrainians turned out on the streets in freezing weather for the 3rd time in 20 years, this time during a war, to stand up for this principle. And that's something that was actively supported by a substantial amount of American assistance. Now the burden for that all falls on the EU accession process, which has been modifying itself rapidly to try to get at to bring forward reforms that are necessary, but often are left toward the end of the process in areas like public procurement and access to justice and the other reforms. So there's a real challenge within the commission structures, and they have a very capable and innovative team, but the US has to also provide some support and sadly will not be able to do it with any money. And this is the final point. The US has cut off the fingertips that we used to understand what is happening. So the last few years, the US averaged about $30 to $35 billion in assistance going to Ukraine. Much of that was managed by AID, now eliminated. There was $8 billion in civilian assistance that went through a part of the bureau that I headed. I can't claim any credit for that, just was what I inherited and it continued. None of that money was misspent or diverted. Multiple independent reviews found that it all went to the people who most needed it. All those people have been fired. The plan at the moment, announced in the reorganization of Secretary Rubio this July, is that they will hire new staff to manage all of AID and states' assistance. It's not clear there will be any of that going toward Ukraine, but here's the real kick in this. The size of staff they are going to hire will be about, according to the Center for Global Development, a great organization, will be about 6% the size of AID's former grant management organization. So they're going to have inexperienced people handling more than 10 times the amount of assistance that had been handled well before. And they probably won't send any of it to Ukraine anyway. So for the US to be in a position to deliver the public goods that are required for the increased investment the Trump administration wants to see in Ukraine is going to be impossible, given what these guys are doing. Oh, and they are guys too. So I think the point here is that the spirit should be willing, but the US flesh is a little weak to help on this process going forward. And so it really will come down to how well Europe can manage this process.
Thank you very much for the sobering look. I think we have heard a lot of that whenever the United States came up during this day. But I think overall our conversation is pointing in the direction that the future of Ukraine in Europe is increasingly also dependent not just on Ukraine's commitment, but on Europe's, the European Union's commitment to ensure that path remains open, to remove the hurdles, and to engage with Ukraine, because as the discussion has also shown, there's much to learn from the experiences of Ukraine on the battlefield and beyond. There is much to benefit from bringing the country on board in how we rethink the European security architecture, how we rethink European strategic autonomy. And unfortunately, for the moment, it seems that the European Union will need to go that alone without the United States in clear support of its endeavors. Unfortunately, I made the strategic mistake of not deliberately ignoring the big white paper showing how much more time we have left. So I know that we are over time. I would like to just abuse my position and give the floor back to Renáta and Dorka for one closing thought, summarized in short, precise sentences, so we can wrap up in the next 3 minutes.
I promise to be short. And to mention one secret weapon / one secret resource that Ukraine has in Europe, which is the diaspora, the Ukrainians living in European Union member states and candidate states, who are the best ambassadors for Ukraine's EU membership, and also the best translators for Ukraine of all the trepidations, impossibilities, and goodwill but strange thoughts that might come out of European governments in the coming months and years.
Short. First, what has to be done in order to integrate Ukraine properly into our security infrastructure is that Ukraine has to win. How we can do that is that we have to ensure that Russia does not earn as much money from us as we are paying it now. And luckily, as my very last sentence, the news of the recent days have shown that at least in this one small thing, probably there are aligning stances among the US and the EU. Therefore, we have to close the money tap, which goes to Russia.
You all are very patient. Thank you very much.
I think that is